Good morning. My name is Marcy Stromgren, and you've tuned in to Just the Facts. I have in the studio today Carl Crawford, the Human Rights Officer for the City of Duluth. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Nice to have you here. You know, I met Carl a couple of years ago, and I asked him who the chair next to him was occupied for, and he said, I've saved it for you. So we hit it off right away, started getting to know each other a little bit, and Carl has since changed his job since he was a couple of years ago, and so I'm going to have him talk a little bit about his background, where he's from, a little bit about his family, and some of the other, well, you were at LSC at the time that I met you, right?
Yes, I was. I was at Lake Superior College, where at that time I was kind of the head of the diversity department or the intercultural center that we had at the college.
Okay. What is the cultural center at Lake Superior College?
It's a very important place at Lake Superior College. It's an opportunity for students that may not see themselves reflected in other areas of the college to have a space to call their home, a place to kind of, as we used to say, drop your backpack, no excuses, just come on in. And I found that it's a very important place. We had a food shelf there that students could come and go and get things that they needed to help them be successful in their college experience. And it really became a place for all students, but specifically students of color used that space.
Who provided the food for the food shelf?
Well, that's probably the most amazing secret, and that was faculty and staff at the college helped provide the food and also material goods, toilet paper, things like that. And believe it or not, Marcy, we actually had pet food, because when you're hungry, guess who else is hungry? If you have pets, they need things as well.
Yes, unfortunately, it's hard for me to reconcile owning an animal when you're having a struggle feeding yourself.
Yes, yes.
But animals have taken a big part of people's lives, and so I can understand that, having had animals since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
So your main job was then up there at the college to do exactly what with the students?
Well, support students, help them reach their goals. I call it to remove barriers, unforeseen barriers, to maybe be that go-between between faculty and staff when there's an issue that arises. So I would help with the petitioning if a student had a struggle or just had to take a step back. How do they come back on board and reach their goal? And for a lot of us, we don't often think about what does it mean to be successful and what are the barriers that happen, especially for those who are living in poverty, and they kind of creep up. So I couldn't necessarily remove all the barriers, but at least try and help to alleviate some of them so they could be successful.
Well, I remember in that conversation, I've had more than one with you, but I asked you, since I used to monitor the 709 school district and I know some of the issues with education, that your concern was these kids are coming to the college, students, and they need 2 years of remedial work.
Yes.
That adds an added financial burden.
It really does.
To the students.
Recent legislation has now not covered the cost of those remedial classes. So it's an added burden now. So if you have someone who went through the school system and they weren't able to be really ready for college, and had to take those remedial courses, in the past they were covered by financial aid, and now they're not. So it's a different burden now for some students to get over that hurdle and then really start their college career.
Well, I find it, I'm going to call it criminal. I went to school, graduated Denfeld,
Denfeld grad.
1965. So now you'll get an idea how old I am. And I wasn't an exceptional student, but in our class, we were the baby boomers, there was 484 kids. for the most part, they graduated not with a piece of paper in their hand,
Yes.
but the ability to go out there and get a job. And one fellow I interviewed for the school board last year, I believe it was, or maybe it's 2 years now, time goes so quickly. He worked for the prisons, and he called our system broken because it's like classroom to prison for some of these kids, which
Yes, it
is really tragic for not only the taxpayers, but the students and everybody involved. When a school is sending a student out
Yes.
ill-prepared to get a job, go to college without having 2 years of remedial work to do, do you see any hope of that being eliminated soon?
I do. And I first want to say I believe that there's a lot of really great teachers and instructors that we have
I agree.
in our school system. I think part of the challenge that we know is our schools are asked to do a lot more than they used to. They're asked to be the parent, the guardian, to provide food, to provide all these other things that our school system typically wasn't just built to do. And I think it's not only the school district, but there's a breakdown in community and a breakdown in all those support systems that we used to have in place to help families that are struggling. In Duluth, we have a large number of people who are living in poverty, living 2 times below the poverty level. And to me, that screams that we need help in community and help with giving parents the tools they need to raise their kids. And some of it, if you look farther back, you have second and third generations of folks that didn't graduate high school, that don't have those other things that help build strong communities and strong foundations.
I'm glad you said that, because it's something that I saw when I was monitoring is you've got parents out there
Yes.
a couple generations back, they can't even help their own children
That's right.
with their studies because they're illiterate themselves. And there again, it's to me it's criminal, because that is not the way we came out of school. And yeah, our teachers had their hands full, there's no doubt about it, but they were not dealing with some of the things that our teachers are dealing with today. So.
That's right. And the world has changed so dramatically, and it can be a vicious cycle, but I'm happy to say we are taking steps to challenge those things and shed some light on looking at solutions that are working throughout our country, and how can we bring some of those solutions into our school systems and into our communities to help raise successful families. Myself, I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and we had a completely different experience than here in Duluth, Minnesota. And for one, believe it or not, there was no cell phones back then.
No,
But-
there weren't when I went to school either.
But our parents, our community were still engaged enough to know that if I as a child was doing something I wasn't supposed to, there was a pipeline that knew exactly what I should be doing, and I needed to go straight home. And I may have had many conversations before I even got home about my behavior and expectations. And I think there's a breakdown in community, because even as you think to yourself, Marcy, how well do we know our neighbors? And how well do we know our community and the kids who are in that community, versus just, passing each other as we go into our homes?
Well, I can certainly attest to that in my own neighborhood. I live in the country, and I know few
Yes.
within. Well, I knew more when I was on the township board, but since I've been off of that, I know fewer. So, okay, leading up to where you're at right now, and your position as the officer
Yes.
of
Human rights.
human rights, thank you. I get a little memory lapse there. Thanks. Your job at LSC prepared you for where you're at right now, you feel, and what you had growing up and living in Los Angeles has all prepared you well for the job you're now doing.
I would like to hope so. I think it's a collective of all those experiences Since I came to this community, to this region, I was involved in civil rights and involved in standing up. I can tell you I was not a willing participant at first. I just wanted to go to school and be an athlete and do those things, but certain things happened in my life that I needed to find a way to stand up. I needed to find resources to advocate for others. And those all experiences came together, in my life and in this position. Every position I've had, whether it was sales or other positions, I always found time to be involved in human rights or civil rights. And I feel very blessed and fortunate to have the position I have now, where that is my full-time job, is helping to advocate for voices that aren't heard.
Can you explain to our audience a little bit more in depth of what you do as a human rights officer?
Absolutely. I like to say my key goal is to make sure that racism and discrimination does not find a place to call home in Duluth, Minnesota. So I work very hard with employment. I work hard with education. We look at healthcare and health disparities. We look at our incarceration and legal system. And we work hard to advocate for those voices, again, that aren't usually at the tables where decisions are being made. So how do we engage our community, and how do we reward our community for things that are working well? Often we spend more time looking at our situation from a deficit instead of really saying, wow, there's really things that are working great. How do we highlight that? How do we get more folks engaged in that activity or that behavior and shine a light on that versus always being stuck in the doldrums of what's negative?
Well, something that is negative, and I bring it up only so we can maybe see if you're involved in that, is there's very large disparity from the western side of the city to the eastern side of the city in the educational opportunities.
Yes.
And that western side is where I came from, so that really bothers me that my old alma mater is a part of that, Denfeld, when it wasn't there before. It was not there before. No. So are you involved at all in helping to fix that problem in some way so that we get more opportunities for the people on the western side of our city?
Yes, indirectly I am. I work with a couple other organizations and groups. The NAACP is one, and other groups that are looking at some of those educational disparities. The Human Rights Commission is currently working with another group that's also looking at some of the disparities. And some of what it comes down to is access and accessibility to programs, to opportunities to enrich our communities. And I often thought that we have a lot of amazing seniors and retired folks that has a wealth of knowledge that we have not tapped into. And I think there may be some opportunities to do that, either within the school system or outside of the school system. We're finding that even folks that don't have the quote-unquote degree, there's knowledge there. And there's knowledge that can be shared with our kids and our young people. I see the fastest growing challenge are those who are not school-aged anymore. It's that group of 19 to 24-year-olds who are just kind of in this perpetual stuck motion of what to do, how to do, and maybe some regrets that they weren't able to take advantage of their schooling when they were in school.
Well, I think in my own situation, there are things that I wish I had done in school, taken a different path. Yet I was prepared to do whatever. I mean, when I went out to get a job, I was prepared enough to do that.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's not the situation today. So how is that student supposed to move forward? Like you say, they're stuck in that position. How can they move forward? are they coming to you and looking for assistance in that area, or are you out there in the public reaching out to them, or how do you make a connection with these?
A little of both, and I think Duluth is very fortunate to have I think a great workforce center that also connects young adults and kids who are looking for jobs and opportunities. But most importantly, what I feel, Marcy, is it's about relationship building. And in the past, maybe when you or I were at an opportunity to go out and look for a job, there was a chance to walk in the door and sell your best self, is what they used to say. But now we have kind of a hidden doorkeeper, and that's the computer. So you have to put in your information in this computer, and you don't have the opportunity to always sell who you are and why this is a great opportunity for you, and more importantly, why you would be a great fit. So we know that the Workforce Center is working with folks on their resumes and just trying to get the right language to get you past that first threshold. But if what I see for a lot of kids and families who are marginalized, they're lacking that relationship. They don't know that business owner in a way to go sit down with them and really sell themselves. So a lot of the times right now to get work or employment, you have to get through the test of the computer. Yeah.
Well, sometimes getting to talk to that employer, like you say, it's the computer that is asking you to make the application.
Yes.
So I see that as a barrier that it seems to me we need to go back to the old way of doing a few things, because the new way is really not as effective.
Well, the new way creates barriers.
Exactly.
Not everyone
Yeah.
have access to computers or that are familiar with them. So even though computers have done a lot of wonderful things in our lives, it has set us back in other areas. And I would love to see almost of a hybrid, a combination of the two, that a young person can still walk in and meet with someone and be able to really share who they are and why they should be given a chance.
Well, yes, but if they go to get this job and they don't have the skills, and
Yes.
I've talked to business owners when they do meet with a potential employee, their skills are lacking right from a simple filling out forms,
Yes.
in learning how and knowing how to read it and understand what's on there in the first place, which goes back to me, it goes back to the irresponsibility of education to get them to that point in the first place. And I recall hearing two teachers out at Denfeld, so a few years back now, they were in the same church, grew up with my children, and one of them was was the same age as one of my children, and the other was a man who had a family there. And they came to the school district and they said, these are 11th grade science and math teachers at Denfeld.
Okay.
There is nothing we can do to bring a student that comes to us with no more than a 5th grade education. We can't bring them up to graduation in a year and a half. It's an impossible task. What is the school district going to do about it?
Yeah, that's
To
a
the
tough
best of my
question.
ability, it hasn't changed.
That's a very hard question, and once we start looking at, number one, I think poverty. Number two, trauma that has happened to a lot of kids and families of living in poverty. And I found myself that poverty is more than just not having enough money. It's a way of life. It impacts your decision making and everything else. So, think of even out of the most loving homes, we have kids who come to school and struggle. Now you add a lot of these other life things that are happening to them. How can they even begin to concentrate in school? The other challenge, I think, is, for our image, we're lacking people of diverse backgrounds that are teaching in the schools. I'm not talking about hall monitors and other things that they do a great job, but for a student to see themselves reflected in their teacher is a big deal, because I often believe if I can see it, then eventually I can be it. And you have that opportunity for someone to see the world as you reflect on the world. My son never had a teacher of color going through the school systems here in Minnesota. Where in my community where I grew up, I had many teachers of color. And it created a different dynamic or relationship. Because often you can match my experience through my teacher's experience. But when you don't have that ability, sometimes there's a disconnect that happens. And our kids aren't as motivated or just aren't as challenged in the right way.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I have not thought of that. Do you see yourself in the position that you're in? Is there any way that you might be able to eliminate some of this type of problem?
Well, I think one way is to continue to talk to potential students about going into education. That's the key, getting young students of diverse backgrounds to be teachers. And it's a very difficult task, but it can be done. So we have to kind of fill that pipeline of future educators that are willing to go into teaching with kids of diverse backgrounds, and hopefully being able to challenge the way things are currently being done. And the other thing is our current teachers may need training and opportunities to talk more about how does either our biases affect the work that we do. And some are conscious, some are unconscious, but they do affect the way we interact with our young people and the conversations we have.
Okay. So what are some of the types of, now you've only been in your position a very short time.
Almost 3.5 years.
Has it been that long?
It has been, but I'll stick with new as long as I can.
I don't, boy, time flies when you're having fun.
It
doesn't
really does.
I can't believe it's been that long. Last week we were supposed to meet, and unfortunately you got called into the mayor's office.
Yes.
With some type of an issue, and I don't want you to be specific, but what are some of the crisis things that you have to deal with?
Oh my goodness, they are many. There's over 96,000 people in Duluth, and with that are 96,000 stories. And
well, we could take a while, but I don't
yes,
know if we got
but not that
long.
long. And often too, it's understanding what are the experiences of people in Duluth living here, visiting here, and when you look at housing alone, we know we struggle with having affordable housing and access for people to have homes here in Duluth, and with that often comes struggles of eviction and miscommunication and creating a transient community where folks are constantly moving to try and survive. When you look at education, we just touched on a little bit about. So imagine even the struggle of getting to school could be a hassle or a challenge.
Do you think that the barrier that has been put up about transporting students that live, and I can't remember the exact mileage, but at one time there was a high school in Morgan Park.
Yes, I've heard.
There was a high school in the east. Then there was a high school on the hill. And students were going all over the place. And when I wanted to get to school, I took a city bus.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Piedmont Heights, and I had to get down to the Lincoln Junior, so I took a city bus. I don't know if the school district provides any types of monies for these students that have to go a long distance to get to the system now that we only have 2 high schools.
Mm-hmm.
Is there money set aside so that they don't have a transportation problem from the school district?
Boy, I can't speak too wisely to that because I'm just not informed with their numbers and how they move kids along. But I know it becomes a barrier when you look at extracurricular activities where, students have to stay after for practice or band practice or choir Often that may result in them finding their own resources for a ride. And, for some families, that's a burden, especially if you have, one vehicle. And the uniqueness of the area we live in is the weather. So when school's in session is one of the harshest times for winter and weather, and that causes another difficulty for students to get around or be mobile, or in some cases even to participate.
Well, being mobile in the wintertime is something I had learned how to do with no problem because I'm born and raised here.
See,
So
for me it was much different. Coming from California and experiencing snow and ice and wind, it took well, I don't know if I'm still all there yet, but it took a long learning curve to understand how to navigate the winters.
how long have you been in the Duluth area?
Luckily, I've been here since 1986. I moved I was at UWS across the bridge
Okay.
in college, and then I moved over to Duluth kind of in 91, 92. So kind of been here ever since. Had a small stint in Seattle for a while, and then came back.
Well, I have to say you should be well seasoned by now, Carl.
Given this past winter, you never know.
Well, now this past winter was one of those. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
it's one for the books.
I do not want a repeat of that one. In my lifetime, it can happen after I'm gone, but please.
Yeah.
And then they have snow on me May 19th when my flowers are popping up out of the ground. I mean, yes, Duluth is a very unusual place to live. There's no doubt about it. And you've got to be tough to live here. So I
Yes.
think that's why God placed so many Scandinavians in this area.
That must be it.
And pity those that are not Scandinavians, sorry.
Yes, we have a tougher time. But it also leads to, one of the other challenges we have in my position is looking at, again, poverty, homelessness, and how do folks navigate harsh winters, tough weather, and still manage to be here. And I think part of the things we got to recognize is we have a very caring community here. There's lots of work to be done, but we do have some organizations that are doing a great job to help people when they're struggling, when they're in trouble, and really help get through the winter. Or for the city this time, in conjunction along with the county, and Chum was able to open up its first warming center. And I'm so happy that we had that during one of the harshest winters we've had in a number of years, that people had a safe place to go when the temperatures were diddly below zero. And I know that conversations are continuing to happen on what may happen for next year and what that may look like potentially for those who are experiencing homelessness.
I'm not familiar with the center that was opened up, but perhaps you can inform the viewers of that. Was something by the county, you said?
Yes, it was a great partnership between the city of Duluth, the county, and Chum that found resources and had a space that was open for folks during the winter when the temperatures reached below zero.
Okay.
And we were able to make connections with some people experiencing homelessness that we weren't able to make connections with before. And we had great community outpouring and help. I mean, gloves and hats were donated. We had certain community businesses help out with food and other resources. And again, it goes back to what I first talked about, building relationships. How do we get to know each other? And at one point, do we stop recognizing each other as human beings and start treating each other differently?
Well, that kind of goes back to thinking about growing up is, you did know your neighbors.
Yes.
You did have some relationships with those people.
Mm-hmm.
And I see by what you're saying that definitely has been a major breakdown
Yes.
in our society today. And so hopefully we can work on that and make it better because, we're all one people when it gets right down to it.
Yes.
And so we do need to be working harder to try and alleviate the suffering of many of those people that are out there that I'm sure you deal with quite a bit. Duluth has built a lot of affordable housing. So not living in the city of Duluth, I try not to listen to the news simply because the less stress I have, the easier it is on my health. So how is that working out? If we've got more affordable housing, is there still not enough from the numbers, or what is the problem?
Yes, it still is not enough. And also we have to understand, Duluth, along with America, has not done a great job of dealing with mental health. Mental health is a crisis that is going throughout our country and our community. That in some cases I don't want to say it's being unchecked, but some of those resources that helped families and people who are experiencing mental health are not there anymore. Some of those programs are gone. So now what we've had is we put stress on other systems to carry the ball, our healthcare systems, our judicial or court systems now. And we know that we have folks in our community, just as across the nation, that are considered hard to house, that really need help with making certain decisions in life. And we don't have those programs anymore. So unfortunately, for a lot of people who are experiencing mental health, not all, but for some, their only opportunity is to live outside or to try and live on their own terms. So they may have housing for a while, but then it becomes very short term because all the other connecting pieces aren't there for them to be in that space. And we have a lot of resources that are helping folks to live on their own, but we still need a lot more resources.
Well, from what I understand about this, not housing some of these very needy people, is the government wanted them to have their freedoms. Now, I could be wrong on that, but some of these people really are not equipped to be able to take care of themselves, to have that freedom that the government said that they should have. So hasn't that exacerbated the problem?
It may have, but I think it's all about, and this is something that I had to learn in my position, it's not always about giving help, it's how that help is given. Is it done in a way that's respectful, with dignity? Do we still honor that person as a human being to make choices? So for me to run down the hill and say I have the problem and I haven't really listened to what's really going on, or did it in a way that's dignified or a way that is accepted. We had a situation where I had a young lady I was working with, and had experiencing the flood and other things that had happened, and she recalled the group of young boys, I think it was the Boy Scouts, who were handing out canned goods as they were going along, and she didn't accept the canned good, and she says, what I really need is a can opener. So how often do we get the right connection of what folks need and match them with the right solution, and do it in a way that's, caring and dignified, and a way that help can be accepted? Often we come down the hill with what we think community or someone may need, but we miss that very important step of having that conversation of what do you need and how would you like to receive that help, that still gives you that independence.
No, I don't expect you to have all the answers, but I could certainly understand handing out a canned good, but who is going to take the role of, say, teaching those people that, okay, lady over here doesn't need your more canned goods, she needs a can opener. Who is it that's going to be taking on that role of implementing the right offer rather than the wrong offer. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Are some of these organizations that you mentioned earlier doing that?
They are, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to look at building those relationships. I talk a lot about critical or meaningful conversations, and think about how many meaningless conversations we have in a week versus really having those meaningful, critical conversations of when we're actually sharing information, being respectful of each other. And that's a lost art. I don't blame computers and texting and all that, because I do some of that as well. But how many times have we walked by others and either said good morning or how are you doing, and by the time the answer is given, we're half a block away?
Well, even smiling at people makes a big difference.
It makes a huge difference, because then that means you see me and that I'm seen. And that's important. I never discount, as I believe with Mother Teresa, that talked about the importance of human touch and connecting and seeing people. And I think all those things are important to how we do things at the city, how I do my job, and how we create community.
Well, I know when I didn't grow up in a home that was real positive.
Okay.
My father was in the Navy, and he was on a ship that would bring the supplies to the troops.
Okay.
The Japanese people liked to blow those ships out of the water. My dad was a gunner's mate on this ship, and it was right off the coast of the eastern part of the United States when it was blown out of the water.
Oh my.
And then they would send another torpedo to kill the men. My father survived that. I consider myself lucky to have survived my childhood, because my father was angry all the time, and there was things that would set him off. We didn't know about PTSD
Yes.
or D or whatever it's called.
Yes.
We had no idea that those things had affected our wounded warriors. And many, many people grew up in those homes when the men came back from World War II. They experienced that type of thing, and so I think there's that trickle-down influence
Absolutely.
of that type of attitude that many of my fellow students grew up in, and I didn't know about it until several years after graduation, and we started communicating more with one
Yes.
another. I mean, we were 485 kids, and you were those little cliques. So, we were no perfect generation by any means. But I learned to understand, and I forgave my father for what I experienced, and I don't need to go into that. But there again, that was a mental
Absolutely.
issue that my father would not talk about. He would not allow anybody to get close to him except my mother, so that you wouldn't even know. And I think that's true with a lot of people. They don't talk about their hurt and their pain, and so it's not that easy to get relationships going with people. And nowadays, if they aren't in their phone, they're looking down or looking away from you because they don't feel good about themselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes a hello, if you can make a little eye contact, is all it takes is for somebody to say hello back to you.
Yes.
I found that true just, within the last, it's taken me a long time, the last few years.
Yeah.
But it's not that easy for most people to just go out there and try and befriend other people. They're not used to it.
That's right. And we only get used to it when we practice it. And I want to thank you for sharing your story, because I know with sharing personal stories, it comes at a cost. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with me. And there are many others out there that dealt with, post-traumatic stress from family. I said my dad, he dealt with post-traumatic street syndrome. He's also a veteran. But growing up as an African-American man trying to raise his family, back in Los Angeles, California, had a whole other set of circumstances. So he has since passed on, and I often said when my dad passed away, it listed other things on why he passed away. But racism, discrimination was never one of those things that were on there. And knowing how that adds to a family, the stress, the heartache, the tension. He was a functioning alcoholic by all means of the words. We've never had to wrestle the paycheck away from him or anything like that, but there were times where he had nowhere to go with his despair. Or
I would say that's exactly what my father was.
Mhm.
Yeah.
hmm So there's things that were happening that, as a man, he wasn't able to handle and deal with. And I try my best to teach my son other ways and other alternatives too. But again, it's a learned behavior. It's something that we need to pass along to our families and to our communities. And the only way we can do that is through sharing our stories, feeling a little vulnerable, but creating those opportunities where we can connect. Because again, when we share our stories, we find ways that we can connect. And we get to see each other in a different light.
Well, I certainly can see the trauma that placed on my brother. My brother and I were only two of us. How it affected his family.
Yes.
As his fathering was very harsh, very much like my father. So
Yes.
I determined through God's grace that I was not going to allow that to continue.
Good.
For my own family. So I think a lot of times it's an awareness of what is crippling us that can help us come out of these traumatic situations. And there again, there's a lot of people that they use drugs or alcohol to numb and dull the pain, and that's not going to help. That does not help anybody. It only exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, it's a short-term solution, but there's a great quote that mentions, when you don't have the footprints to follow in the snow, you can often get lost. So when we look at community, what is the legacy that we're teaching, showing our kids, showing our other friends and neighbors who are also parenting and learning how to do things? How do we create those experiences that we have shared experiences of solutions that work? And how do we build stronger communities? And everyone uses the line, it takes a village to raise a child, right? But what happens when that village is unhealthy? What kind of children are we going to be producing? And it takes us to be willing to be humble, to be vulnerable, to get to know each other, to build those strong relationships. And, it's very difficult for some communities to ask for help. Because help is not a sign of weakness. Actually, help is a sign of strength, of recognizing that there's a deficiency, there's something I need help with. And when we start to look at mental health, alcoholism, drug addiction as something different than, I'm going to cast you away to this island, and really giving people the help that they need, we'll start to see some of that transformation in our communities.
Well, we'll go from there then.
Yes.
What have you seen as you've worked now, some of the positive things that, besides what you spoke about, coming together to provide shelter for homeless this past winter, what other things have you seen that are working that...
Duluth is an amazing city, and being in my position, I've been able to see Duluth really come alive and show that it is a caring community. When I first came on board, my first week here at the city of Duluth was the big windstorm, the big blowdown storm. And I watched many people in the community come together and, help folks remove trees. We had some folks whose power was out, and some companies came and helped them with groceries and other things. And it was that point when I said, boy, this is a community I really want to be a part of, one that cares about each other and is willing to go the extra mile. So I'm often inspired by that, and inspired by a lot of people that work for the city. There's a caring group of people, a lot of pride, where I think folks really want to start out and do their best job possible. As we talked earlier, none of us are perfect. But if we continue to try and do our best, as much as possible. I've started to see some of those changes within our city. The other thing is we have a strong and thriving business community. Our healthcare industry is growing and expanding. Even though we struggle with affordable healthcare, we still have a lot to toot our horn about in Duluth. And part of my job along with community is to continue to highlight where those blind spots are and challenge each other to be better, to do better. And often that's not an easy conversation to have, but I've found it's always worth having that conversation, as difficult as it may be, to maybe stop progress and say, what are we actually doing? Who's being helped and who's being hurt? And how do we make this a bigger win for everybody?
The blowdown was quite an impacting thing to
Yes, for you out in the country.
Earmark your administration with it. Yes, I live in the country, and my son. Well, okay, the power's out.
Yes.
How do you get in the garage when all you do is push a button?
You don't get in the garage.
You don't get in the garage. Where do you suppose the generators are to keep
in the garage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
So my son came along with with the generator. He lives in the city, but he got it from a friend, and he brought it out. So we got to use the generator to keep the freezers that were full of food and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then my husband tore off the front of the garage on the one side.
To get in? To
get in so he could get the garage up, so he could get the car out.
Yes, to manually do it. So we learned a lot about community. One of the things we learned about also was, what happens in our own disaster relief efforts, and we didn't realize that, we don't have a shelter or a place for people with pets. So what does that look like for someone who may have an assisted animal or things that they need with them to go to a shelter? Or what happens with our beloved four-legged friends during a disaster? Where do they go? There's been a group, an organization that's been working hard to look at Duluth and how would we handle if ever a disaster happened. Are we going to be ready or prepared to do that work? And they've worked with other agencies throughout the city and the community of Duluth to do that.
I never thought of that as being a problem, but certainly it would have been when there's no power.
Yes.
And,
my heart goes out to those communities who are right now experiencing floods and hurricanes and tornadoes throughout our country. And it's hard to watch the devastation on television, but more importantly, I look at what are going to be the cleanup efforts. How is that community going to survive moving forward? And today we're looking at the last week of school for kids. Imagine those schools are devastated, and the kids aren't getting the education, they aren't going to school right now because all their efforts are on cleanup and how people are going to get around and get the medical help and things that they need.
There's a lot to think about during a disaster, isn't there?
Yes.
Well, so you weren't here during the 2012 flooding.
I was.
You were?
Yes.
Okay.
I remember that.
Did that affect you at all?
Not as bad, but I recall at that time I was working at the college, and I did not get the call that school was closed. So if you remember back then, they had the picture of the canoes and kayaks in the parking lot of grandmas in that area up on the hill. And that was the way I would go into work. So I was met with the flooding in the streets, and it could happen quite fast. So if you don't know what's going on in your community or your surroundings, you could be trapped.
Right.
So it's important that we heed the warnings when they come out. I'm often amazed at Minnesotans that when there's a blizzard and the schools are closed, the mall is busy. Because folks still need to venture out and say they experienced that. But maybe it's a part of me getting older. I kind of heed the warnings now.
Well, I think age has something to do with it.
It's a little bit to do with it.
If that snowing is too hard, the world's not going to stop.
Yes. Button down the hatches. I'm staying in.
I'm staying in, and I'm not going to be one of those fatalities on the road because
Yes.
it's not worth it to go out
And
there.
understanding when we do those things, we also put our emergency care people at risk.
Right, exactly.
So,
Yeah, Minnesota, Duluth, there's some challenges a person has to learn how to navigate. And it sounds like you've adjusted well to your surroundings.
still working at it. When you start to judge your time here by the number of winters you made it through, that's a little different.
Well, we're about out of time here, Carl. I think we've still got a few more minutes left here. Is there anything that you would like to say to the public about how they could be useful to the community, besides you mentioned the fact that seniors could be utilized because of their wealth of information? Any other points you'd like to make?
Oh, there are many. I think one of the important things that community can continue to do is challenge and understand the golden rule. Treat others as you like to be treated, but go farther. Ask others how they would like to be treated. Get to know each other. Build relationships. A group that's often forgotten in this discussion are folks with disabilities and how we have access or opportunities for housing, jobs, employment for all Duluthians and all people that visit our area. And, you heard the adage now, when you see something, say something. Well, the same goes well with human rights and understanding what does that mean when people have an opportunity to experience our great city and live in our city, but to take a look around and question, why are all these folks having a great time and maybe this group of folks aren't? And are there barriers or procedures or policies we should be looking at that are prohibiting everyone from having access and a great opportunity? I mean, this is a beautiful area. It's a lovely place. But is it that way for everyone?
My friend, he's passed away now. He was in a wheelchair. And it came home really hard one time in church when people come over and start talking to me.
Yes.
And he's sitting right here.
Yeah.
And they would ignore him.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd have to deliberately say, and I know they already had, because it went on more than once. I said,
Yes.
have you met my friend Tom?
Yes.
And so dealing with handicapped people, I have no problem with it. But a lot of people, it's difficult for them to communicate.
Yes.
They don't know what to say. They feel uncomfortable around them. And so I've seen that a problem, a definite problem. But
Yes.
you can't, I don't know, you just can't fix everything.
Right.
And human nature is what human nature is, unfortunately. So you
Yes.
just have to hope for the best, that we can learn to get along, because
Mm-hmm.
God created us from two people. So we're all one. We're all
Yes.
one in different color, different cultures, but we're still all one when it gets right down to it.
Yeah.
So
And don't be afraid to take a risk. Challenge each other. And when you do make a mistake, own it. And the important thing happens after you made a mistake, right? And it's brought up, are you going to change behavior, change your outlook, or are you going to continue to do what you do that may inflict harm? So I have great faith in Duluth and the work that we're doing here, and we're changing lives, maybe one conversation at a time.
well, and it's been great having you in here, because ever since you got that job, I thought it'd be interesting to find out more about what it is that you do,
Yes.
so that other people are more familiar with the position you hold as a human rights director.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here and very humbled to have that position to help our community.
Thank you for tuning in today, folks, and thanks again, Carl, for coming
you.
and talking.
Yes.
Have a great day. Bye now.